of knowing.
All right, man. Welcome to Crow 777 Radio. This is episode 203. Jason Lindgren is with me as always, and we have a new guest today, Andy Kaufman. And we're going to talk about a lot of things: bacteria, what makes people sick, the idea of detoxification, all kinds of things like this. And then in hour two, we're going to open up and address some maybe more immediate concerns, if you follow what I'm saying. Welcome, Jason.
Good morning, Crow, and it's a fine good morning here in Louisiana.
So we're starting off at square one. We had quite a lead going. Now we're going to have to catch up. But do you have anything for the introduction here that matters?
I think just a few reminders that we have the soundtrack up on CD Baby, if anybody's interested. There's a few new t-shirts up on the Teespring shop. The live streams, if anybody's not aware, every Sunday, you and I do a live stream on my Secrets of Saturn channel from 5 to 6 p.m. Central, which is my time, so 6 to 7 Eastern. And that's at the same time we did TFR. And then every Wednesday from 8 to 10 Central, Wayne McCroy and I do a live stream. And sometimes Crow joins us there as well.
Right. Okay. There's all the stuff. Shall we continue?
Let's move.
All right. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you. Good morning, guys. It's really an honor to be on your show.
Hey, I'm looking forward to this as we went over the topics and arranged them carefully so that they could be delivered to as many minds as possible. There's a number of very interesting things here. And if you have followed our work, you might be familiar with some of the naturopath, homeopath, well-trained doctors in many disciplines, to include Ayurvedic and maybe Asian or Chinese styles of what we call medicine, to include the work that the Germans have done, some really cutting edge work that was supposed to be announced around how people get sick and viruses and these ideas, but apparently that was never published. But you want to jump right in here? I'll get us started if you do.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've approached this kind of a long strategy. So coming from my background in medicine, I started just noticing that the things that I was trained to do as an allopathic physician were not successful. And so I started investigating that further, looking at the research literature, and I started seeing that actually there's quite a bit of mortality and morbidity, which are the medical words for kind of death and destruction, that actually are caused by our practice of medicine. And once I realized this and started questioning things, it was kind of like peeling the layers of an onion. I kept going down deeper and deeper, and ending up at a very fundamental level, realizing, as in many other areas, when you start to investigate truth, that once you get down to the base assumptions that you are working under and question those, and those are actually not true, it's like a house of cards that everything can fall apart. And I see lots of people, like you mentioned, you had several excellent guests on your show before talking about other orientations of medicine and natural healing. And I listen to a lot of those people, and I'm always looking for new information, new wisdom. And what I see, though, is that many people have recognized at the higher levels that something is not right with our healthcare system and with how we think about disease and health. But they haven't gone down to this fundamental level. And once you see that some of the, basic underlying arguments that our healthcare system were created on are actually based completely not in the truth, then everything else you look at through different lens. So whereas before I saw, simply a clinical study showing a bad outcome, now I would be looking at that and saying, well, the whole basis for what the healthcare system did to these people is based on fallacy. So looking at the outcome itself makes it a much more dire finding, because you see that it's not that they did something that helped some people and harmed a few people, but it's that they did something that couldn't have really helped because it wasn't based on how our bodies work. And in the process of doing that, a lot of people were harmed and no one was really helped. So it's been, quite a personal revolution for me going through this process to arrive at these conclusions. And I think, to get to that base level, we have to look at the paradigm of healthcare and what it's based upon.
Do you want to give your background just so everybody knows right exactly where you're coming from? Because that's probably really important to understand for the listeners just how well trained you are and what you're looking at and saying, hey, I see problems here.
Right. Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So I studied molecular biology and chemistry as an undergraduate, and I went on then to become a physician assistant, which is like a mid-level provider. So I worked directly with physicians. And I took that job actually as a junior faculty member of the medical school in South Carolina, working on the hematology and oncology service. So I was working with cancer patients, bone marrow transplant patients, people with rare blood disorders, very, very sick people. And that's where I got my real first taste of seeing that, really no one was cured of cancer that I worked with. Pretty much everyone died. There was, like one rare cancer that had a very unique treatment that was actually based on vitamin A. And those people got better. But, I saw like 2 people that had that illness in 2 years, and everyone else that got all of the traditional therapies, the bone marrow transplant, chemotherapy, radiation, even some immune therapies that were budding at the time, everyone died of those people. So then I went on, continued my education, went to medical school, earned my MD from the Medical University of South Carolina, and decided to study and specialize in psychiatry. So I went to Duke for my residency there, and then continued my training in upstate New York for a fellowship in forensic psychiatry. So I'm trained in those specialties, and I continued to work in academic medicine for the earlier part of my career, held several leadership positions, conducted some research, have several published articles and book chapters. And then luckily, I moved out of the academic realm and experienced a lot of kind of negative things there in terms of politics and et cetera. And now practicing on my own. And once I really woke up to this truth about healthcare, I began investigating alternatives and looking for what's really going on with our health and our bodies.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll lead us in here. Let's get into the nuts and bolts. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to rephrase that. We'll leave the nuts for the evening news and we'll get into the bolts here. There's been a lot of to-do about germ theory. Online, people can do just easy searches to see how many people are going in to rethink, to challenge germ theory, and this includes bacteria and viruses. And there's a thing called terrain theory. So why don't you jump in there, Andy, and we'll talk about germ theory, bacteria and viruses, and whatever the heck it is that is called terrain theory.
Absolutely. And, this is such a central thing to understand at this fundamental level, as I was saying before, because the big paradigm of our healthcare system is a warfare model, right? We're always we're fighting against an invader that comes into our body, right? There's a war on cancer. There's a war on drugs, right? We have this warfare mentality in many areas, but it's central in healthcare. And it's based on germ theory. And so what germ theory is, and which was basically told to me as fact, even though it's called germ theory, it was taught to me in my medical education, but even way before that, in my biological education as fact. And what it says is that basically disease is caused by an agent that comes from outside our body and invades and causes that disease. And there are some people who think that, or have thought historically, that this was the cause of all disease. But certainly there's a big push in medicine to find an infectious agent for almost every disease possible, including diseases that you would think have nothing to do with infections, like autoimmune diseases. So this is a very, very central thing. The basis of all treatment of infections is based upon germ theory. The thing is that germ theory is not based upon good science. And there was a vigorous debate about the origin of life and the origin of disease in the 1800s, mid to late, even into the 20th century. And the debate wasn't quite over when Pasteur's germ theory was taken up by the mainstream and promoted as the new medical paradigm. And so Pasteur actually didn't even come up with the idea. He basically plagiarized another scientist, Antoine Béchamp, who was his contemporary, but a much more serious scientist. And throughout his career, Pasteur plagiarized and stole several findings and ideas from Béchamp. Even pasteurization was not Pasteur's idea originally. So Béchamp was a very brilliant scientist, and he did a number of experiments about fermentation. And fermentation was seen as a model of life and of transformation of life. So they were thinking about, what makes an organism alive or dead, what's the origin of life. There was a pre-existing theory of spontaneous generation, that essentially the body of an organism is like a sterile environment, and there was a spontaneous generation of life into that organism that resulted in the living being. And Béchamp did a number of experiments, and one of the early experiments that actually led to the germ theory was where he had several flasks of sugar solution that he mixed with different salts, and some of them had air in the container and some of them did not have air. And he looked at the fermentation products of these vessels. And he found that many of them actually didn't ferment, the ones that had no air and the ones that had certain salts that may have inhibited growth. But what he learned from this is that the microorganisms that were already discovered to be involved in fermentation actually came from the air. So this was kind of a preliminary experiment. And when he discovered they came from the air, then that could mean that germs that cause disease come from the air. I want to just back up a second, because I think language is very important to understand in this whole realm. And the word germ itself, actually, the meaning of that is a bud or a shoot. So it has a meaning of new life or new growth. And taking that word and turning it into a description or a meaning of a villain, something that invades your body and causes disease, is quite an inversion of meaning there. And, I think that's, I'm not sure where the term originally was coined, but it's really not used properly in this current paradigm. So Béchamp had this discovery, and then about 2 years later, Pasteur basically copied this experiment, but he did it in a very sensational way, where he loaded up these bottles and went on like a tour of the French vineyards and captured air at the different vineyards to show that there are different germs in the air at different places that could cause fermentation. And but it basically just replicated Béchamp's experiment. And then at a meeting later, Pasteur gave the results of this and claimed it was his own idea. And when Béchamp at the end got up to refute and say that he originally discovered this, Pasteur just ran out of the building and didn't even give him a chance to sort of confront him.
We should interject here. We've done a number of episodes talking about fermented foods and how healthful many of them are. The idea being that you're eating something with life in it. Like cheese used to be before the idea of pasteurization by Louis Pasteur, we are told. I get emails from places like Switzerland, all over Europe, all the time, saying we still have cheese that's not been pasteurized. It's living. So really kind of what you're pointing to is what Pasteur was involved in was basically convincing everyone to cook the life out of everything we ingest. Wasn't that a big part of it?
Absolutely. Well, if the life is what causes disease, then you have to get rid of it, right? And this is obviously it's just like antibiotics, right? Look at the meaning of that word, right? It means against life. So we're using it to try to improve our health, but it's against life. It is a big contradiction here in this warfare model.
So let's back up a minute and be very clear. It makes you wonder in World War II if the prefix germ was being somehow mentally manipulated as the Germans invaded everywhere. But that's a side thought. Let's get back to the germ theory. And as you pointed out, it's called germ theory. It's a bit like gravity, right? Gravity is a theory based on a theory, and yet it is treated like a law. And you would think something of that much, and I'll make the pun, gravitas, would be proved out to be a law, a solid thing that we can prove. Right. So we're looking at a similar idea here, but let's get back to bacteria and viruses. Is the underlying, and by the way, we still need to, was that a definition of terrain theory? If not, we need to make sure we let people know what terrain theory is. But bacteria and viruses, so what's the bottom line here? Are they misdescribed? Is what they are and how they affect us misdescribed? Is that the idea?
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of disease, it is. But I think it's important to mention that Béchamp did additional experiments that basically showed that the microorganisms can come from inside as well. So he did these experiments with decaying dead cats, for example. And these organisms were able to undergo putrefaction without any air or outside contamination at all. And what happened is that there were these tiny little particles left at the end when all of the tissue was gone. And he called these microzyma. And these little particles are basically the origin of all of these single-celled microorganisms like bacteria and fungi. And it's been shown through other experiments that they exist in all of us, in all plants and animals. And for example, in humans, you can see them in the red blood cells under a dark field microscopy. This is another thing about life and death. When medicine takes samples from your body and looks at it under the microscope, they're always looking at dead tissue. So they take the sample of tissue and they apply chemicals to it that essentially fixes and kills the tissue. I mean, things like formaldehyde, and then they apply stains. So when you're looking at those tissues under the microscope, you can't see how they behave at all. They're completely dead. It would be like if you were an alien trying to study the Earth and you wanted to, study dogs, then you would go and find a dead dog and look at it under the microscope instead of find a living dog and observe it behave while it's alive. So there's another type of microscopy that was used by several of the German scientists that followed Béchamp and Pasteur, like Enderlein and Gaston Naessens, and where they could actually take a blood sample and visualize it alive under the microscope and observe how the cells behave and what happens. And so you can see in that type of microscopy, these little particles, which were called microzyma by Béchamp. They've had several names since then. Protids and somatids are the other two most common names used. And once they started observing these, then they basically mapped out a whole cycle where these little particles can be activated by environmental cues. So in other words, some place in your body needs them for some reason, and they bud out of the red blood cells, and they change their shape, and they can form basically bacteria or fungi in their ultimate iteration going through the life cycle. So they can basically differentiate into these terminal species that we would see under the microscope and identify as bacteria, even by conventional means. And so this is the origin, actually, of these microorganisms. They come from inside of us. And like I said, they're present in any plant and animal. And it was discovered that when these are taken out of the air, like those experiments where they cause fermentation, they basically were left behind from an animal or plant that died. And they were just kind of floating around, maybe looking for the next host that they might settle in. And it's quite interesting that after, your entire body decays, this is what's left, are these little microzyma. They seem to be immortal, that they don't perish and die the way that our human cells do. So the terrain medicine is sort of based on this discovery, and it looks at the role of these microorganisms in the world as the same as in your body, which is they are the nature's scavengers and cleanup crew and recyclers. So when there is tissue damage, they respond to come in and clean it up and help repair the area. And so they're incidental to disease, but not the cause of disease. And that's essentially what terrain medicine says, is that the soil of the body, or the terrain of the body, the tissues and cells of the body, if those are damaged, then there is disease. And then a whole series of things get set in motion to deal with that damage or disease. And the microorganisms are one important part of that.
So, Jason, I can already tell that we're probably going to have Andy back, because I'm looking at the list of very interesting things we have to go over, and we're still on the first bullet point. So what I'm going to do here, Andy, is
it's too much detail. I'm sorry.
Well, it's really not, and it's fine. When we have interesting guests with so much to offer, we typically do have them back. But for the sake of the first hour, I'd like to get in at least a number of topics, because I'm sure people want to hear about AIDS. Do viruses cause disease? The immune system, antibiotics, microbiome. I mean, there's a whole list in front of me, and we're still dealing with germ theory to try to paint a picture that people can understand. So on the germ theory, let me cut to the chase. Germ theory basically states that these foreign entities, for lack of a better description, get into our body and they make us sick. A lot of people are questioning this. Is it questionable if someone comes and says bacteria and viruses come from outside of us, get into our body and make us sick? Is that an acceptable thing for a human mind to accept? Or has that been challenged now? And there's every reason to think that we need to know a hell of a lot more before we just jump on these things are making us sick bandwagon.
Well, it's more like the germ theory was really jumping the gun, because that avenue of research was not fully explored yet. So it was really premature, and everything has been based on it because it provided this model, and it was provided a extremely successful commercial strategy forward through petrochemical medicine. So we have believed this for a century now, and people generally don't question this until very, very recently. But if you want to look at this as a scientist going back and reviewing the papers and seeing where they lead, you would have given up on germ theory a long time ago.
So let's just go back to words have meaning. If you see the word theory behind anything, what you're looking at is an unproven idea. I can make up an idea right now. I have this idea that we can breed pink monkeys that have pink fur. That's my pink monkey theory. And I know that's a bit absurd, but I think people understand what we're getting at. What I'm going to do here, Jason, is I'm going to skip one or two, get to the interesting points, and I'm going to kick it back over to you. So, Andy, there's this whole thing about AIDS that started years ago with a doctor who started looking carefully at the AIDS testing mechanisms. By the way, for some reason, Lord only knows why, most of these videos have been pulled from the internet. And basically at the time, it caused a whole bunch of people to look at this thing we call AIDS that they thought they knew about in a whole new light, thinking, wait a minute, we don't know anything about this and we need to re-examine it. And while I don't remember the exact specifics, I will try to draw from memory what started these unquestionable things that are now questionable. If I recall, the test was looking at a protein, and what the doctor did was demonstrated that it had no basis to walk away with an end result that this disease we call AIDS is the outcome of this test. What in fact was found was that people had been tested on one day and found to have AIDS, and tested on another and found not to. And the outcome of that line of research was that this is completely nonsensical. It is not founded in science. And this is all basically a falsehood. So let's get into your ideas. Can we talk about AIDS for a minute carefully?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because people will lose their damn minds if we don't thread the needle here.
Well, I think the HIV test is an excellent place to start because there are so many levels of obfuscation going on with this test. So first of all, let me just tell you that it's not FDA approved. Now, why the hell do we have an HIV test for one of the most important diseases of our generation, and it's not even FDA approved?
All right, you don't need to say anything more. I think everyone understands it. No, I'm sorry. I'm trying to make a point here as carefully as I can, but go ahead.
Well, I understand the FDA is a low bar, but it couldn't even meet that low bar. So the way that Gallo, who did not isolate any virus, but the way he came up with the test is that he took some human immune cells, right, the kind that are supposedly infected in this illness, and he mixed them with some nasty chemicals that would put stress on them, chemical stress. He put in there hydrocortisone, okay, which is a corticosteroid. It changes the cells at the nuclear level, how they transcribe genes, and incubated these cells. So basically put these cells under stress. And what happens when cells are under stress? They initiate inflammation. They change shape. Some cells may undergo apoptosis, where it's like programmed cell death. They extrude protein fragments into the serum. So all these kinds of reactions that they have. So it's a great setup. There's all kinds of material for antibodies to bind to. And he basically just developed an antibody that binds to this kind of nasty, stressed cellular debris. And that's the HIV test. So anyone that is in a state of cellular stress, oxidative stress, can test positive. And there's at least 50 conditions that have been well characterized that can show a false positive HIV test, including things like pregnancy, hepatitis, et cetera, et cetera.
That's all very interesting for a simple reason. There are a lot of people out there today saying things like inflammation is the cause of all disease. And one of the things you said there was they basically caused inflammation. But this is part of the problem with the modern world that we live in. If we want to have an adult conversations about the validity of things like AIDS or viruses or other things, first of all, most of the people start to lose their damn minds if something is covered that they don't agree with, which is unfortunate. And secondarily, the censorship around all these things should let every mind know out there that when things are censored, there is a damn good reason to take a more careful look. I think we'll leave AIDS there for a minute. But Jason, do you want to jump in and steer this ship somewhere meaningful?
Well, I'm sure a lot of folks do want to know more about AIDS, but that's probably more of an hour two thing, I would say.
Absolutely, because I know what I want to say right now.
Well, I can certainly have a lot more to say on it as well.
And maybe we'll pick up on that. But why don't we jump down to viruses in general and what the mainstream says about viruses and what you might have come across and come to conclusions of about viruses.
I want to be blunt. Do viruses cause disease, Andy?
No. Unless you're a bacteria, maybe.
All right. Let's fake like none of that was said and go ahead and follow on with Jason's question.
Well, virus is another thing that you have to look at the meaning of the word, because the word virus comes from the Latin, and it means a noxious or poisonous substance. Okay, so it long predated this. And in fact, before the notion of what we think of as a modern virus was even understood, people used the term virus when they were studying disease as basically the poison that caused the disease, because there was always this view that there was some poison in the air causing the disease. So they used that term before this modern concept. But basically what happened is that viruses do exist in lower organisms. So in single cell organisms like bacteria and algae and amoebas.
I got to interrupt you, and I'm sorry for doing so, but this is a thing I want to ask you because it comes up so often. So many of the supposed images of what is called a virus have been by image experts shown to be CGI, like so much of the space stuff we see. Are there real images of viruses, first of all?
So yeah, that's what I was getting at. So these, like viruses that infect bacteria, they're called bacteriophages. And I've actually worked with these in the laboratory in college. And these have been seen under electron micrograph. There's lots of pictures you can find on the internet. In fact, I have this article from the University of California, San Francisco that has some excellent photos. And you can tell that they're real electron micrographs.
I'd like to post those in the comments forum under this episode because I can't tell you how many emails will come about what we're talking about. So I'm
Absolutely.
Sorry. Go ahead.
And one of the most prominent and sharpest scientists to talk about this issue is Dr. Stefan Lanka, who's a German scientist, and he actually started his career studying a virus that infects sea algae, and he isolated the virus. He was able to photograph it with an electron microscope, and he was able to characterize it biochemically. And those are basically the scientific criteria to identify a virus.
So you're saying that in the algae, there's a virus. You haven't told us whether it's a living thing or not. But what would happen, just to jump ship for a second here, if a human being ate that algae and the algae wasn't poisonous? what would become of that virus?
Well, let me tell you that the virus doesn't actually cause disease in algae. It actually plays a helpful role, like a symbiotic role, by exchanging genetic material. So I think what would happen is that it would basically not affect you at all, because one, it would probably be destroyed in your gut. But even if it wasn't, it has no ability to recognize human cells. It's specifically trophic, or can only identify, the algae that it lives with.
I apologize for pushing and shoving, but I want to get so much as I can into hour one. Are there other things we would call a virus that are found inside a human being that we could say are alive?
Yeah, so it's great that you talked about the pictures, because no virus that allegedly causes human disease has ever been isolated and then an electron micrograph or photograph has been produced of it, because it's never been seen. But there are lots of pictures. Some of the pictures, like you mentioned, are completely made up CGI pictures. Like there was recently a CDC thing on the current disease that showed a CGI like this, and it was very scary looking. It was a human cell that was in blue with a bunch of these red virus particles attacking it. Looked very scary, but that was completely made up, an artist's conception. But there are other pictures of micrographs that are real. They're real pictures, but they don't show an isolated virus particle. What they show is different things. So they showed those cellular breakdown products that I described earlier in the HIV test. Sometimes they show the inside of a cell like a human cell, and then there's basically a particle there. But there's no way to say that particle is a virus. So like I saw an image like this that was in the endoplasmic reticulum, which is an organelle inside of a human cell. And that's where proteins go for what's called post-translational processing. It's kind of like the finishing shop. They get little things added on, they get folded up a bit. And that's exactly what it would look like. It would look like a particle, the same as they called a virus on these pictures. So there's a lot of obfuscation about this. They're showing a picture of something. It's a real something, but they're just picking a little dot here and saying, oh, that's the virus, without any proof. There's not a special label, molecular label placed on it. There's no way it doesn't have any special shape. Like all the ones of the bacterial viruses, the bacteriophages, and other ones of small organisms like amoeba. There's some viruses that infect amoeba. You look at these pictures and you see they all have a unique shape, a very geometric shape, a very detailed shape, that you could identify these things as distinct entities, or distinct, at least a distinct image that you could recognize over and over again. But the pictures that are allegedly of the viruses infecting humans, there's no such thing at all.
It's kind of ironic. You could get a picture of this scary looking thing, give it some royal name, and then make it kind of purpley for max impact. But I want to get your reaction on this. We've had other very educated medical professionals from all over the world, training from all over the world, who had been working on the idea of what would be the best way to describe a virus. And lo and behold, there was German teams apparently doing cutting edge. So what's your reaction to this? It was suggested that a better way to describe viruses would be electromagnetic vampirism, to try to illustrate in some meaningful way how people could think about, like when someone has the flu. There's a good example. So someone's clearly sick. They've got diarrhea, they're throwing up. We typically call this the flu. The idea is that this living little thing we call a virus got in them. But with the German research, and the other man, who I guess I won't name and do him a favor, was saying is that the conditions are electromagnetic. And when the conditions, it's like a low field happens or something, and it attracts the thing that makes you sick. But the idea behind it was it would be better described as an electromagnetic thing going on. And the idea of vampirism is basically it's sucking all your energy away. What do you think about all that?
Well, I think it's very interesting. And, the idea of sort of I think when you say vampirism, it reminds me of parasitism. And there are lots of parasite disease models, right, that we could adapt, and not just from humans, but from other organisms where the parasite can actually even change your behavior. It's quite interesting. And I've thought a lot about this in schizophrenia based upon some work of Jerry Marzinski and some others as well. But I can't really say that I'm aware of any evidence, like if you want to look at a disease, like let's just say the flu, okay, right? Because this is, we're told that the flu is caused by a virus. Most of us have had personal experience with the flu. So we know, that it's like a bad cold. It makes you achy. It's no fun. So if there's not a virus that causes it, what actually causes it? And so I want to say, I don't know for sure the answer to this. I'm searching for the answer to this. I think I know what some possibilities could be. So one thing I think that actually toxic exposures can explain a lot of these acute illnesses on a small scale. I think that there are possible psychological causes. I've been learning a lot about German new medicine lately, which really delves deep into that. And I think there's some merit to that. And there also could be that some of these things could just be about renewal, that we go through a process. Like I heard this very interesting about colds one time, because, we tend to get colds during a certain season of the year, right? And our bodies always are undergoing cycles, and some of those cycles are seasonal. Like a lot of our biological cycles are, tuned to the sky clock. That's an area that I need to do more investigation about, but it's clearly true. So what if we just have some kind of renewal cycle that in the beginning of the winter, around the solstice, that our upper airway is time to renew itself, and that it initiates this kind of upper respiratory infectious process as a way to clean up the damaged tissue from the year, there filtering out all the stuff in the air that we breathe, and et cetera. And it's just a renewal process. So that could simply be the cause of some of these things.
That's such an interesting idea, because it was 3 years ago, I got the flu twice in January, and I've only had what I would call a flu a very few times in my life. But this is what happened when you're going through it and everything is coming out of you everywhere. It feels like your body's trying to flush out. But what I recalled, and because I was really paying attention to it based on a lot of the research that we try to do, when I was through it, and it was pretty bad getting through it, boy, did I feel renewed as I came back out of feeling sick. But my point here is the whole time it felt like my body was trying to just flush itself out, if you follow.
Absolutely. Almost all the symptoms of an acute illness that we have are all for that purpose, right? All of the fluid that comes in washes the stuff out, and then, it runs out of our nose, it drips down our lungs, makes us cough, it gives us diarrhea, right? All sweating that we get with fever, all of that stuff is eliminating these toxins from our body. Right. And that's the main process, I think, that we undergo with recovery. And, I found in using some natural healing techniques, that if you simply support that function of your body, that you recover from illness much quicker.
How do you support that function of your body?
Yeah, well, there's a number of ways. So I think the best example that I've have found that just works amazing is if you have a gastrointestinal type of illness, an acute illness where you have diarrhea and vomiting. I've done this with my children several times. You take some activated charcoal, about 1 tablespoon for an adult, and basically what that does is it just binds up the stuff the germs your body's dumping inside the lumen of your gut. And once it's absorbed in that charcoal, then it can't cause any more symptoms. So it's basically kind of bound up and inactivated. And then if you're having that kind of an illness, you probably don't need anything to move it through your bowels, because you're already having the diarrhea and the hyperperistalsis. So you'll just get it out. So when I've done this several times, after that charcoal, there are no more symptoms.
Well, I don't know what you think you're doing with such a no-nonsense, common-sense approach. What's that all about? Don't we need like a pharmaceutical biochemist to come in and make something we've never heard? No, I'm making a joke here. But so if you take, for an adult, you said a tablespoon of
tablespoon.
activated, do you just take it with water? And by the way, I know people will probably think about this or have done this. I'm guessing that once you've done that, you know when it's come out the other end.
Yeah, yes, you definitely know. And, I mean, if you do this, there's a chance you might throw up and then it might come out that way, but it will still work. But yeah, you just put it in a glass of water, stir it around, drink it down. And, when you start feeling that grit in your mouth, then stop, add some more water, stir it again, because you don't want it to be too nasty, but it's really easy to do. When I give it to my kids, I add a little bit of juice in there to make it more palatable.
Can you go to any of these health food places and get activated charcoal that's fit for human consumption?
Well, you can even get it in any random local drugstore. It may not be in the ideal form. I try to get an organic form in a tin, but in a pinch, I had to go to the drugstore one time and they had these little capsules. So I just emptied out the capsules into water. I mean, it's charcoal. You can't mess it up that much.
Well, then let's take this a step further. What are your ideas about using this method as a preventative or a maintenance? What if someone decided once a week I want to take a teaspoon of this? Is there a reason to do it, or is there a reason not to do it?
Well, there is definitely a reason to have ongoing cleansing. I think because, and in fact, I wanted to read you a quote. It's not too long, but it introduces this topic because this is really the reason why we have to do so much detox right now. And this is from Nancy Turner Banks, who wrote an excellent book about AIDS. But she writes, over the last 100 years, as the result of rapid industrialization combined with cartelization, and particularly during the last 50 years, we've witnessed an unprecedented event in evolutionary biology. The massive toxic poisoning on an unimaginable scale of the human metabolic system, not only from industrial products, but also industrial waste and increasingly from powerful electromagnetic fields, blah, blah, blah. And I want to add to that, and from food, which is, I think, one of the main sources. And because we have this bombardment and, we can do a lot to reduce our exposure, but we cannot eliminate it. Because things like chemtrails and electromagnetic radiation that we just can't avoid altogether, air pollution.
Let me put a fine point on it. There's a movie that many people remember from the 70s called Oh God, with John Denver and George Burns playing God. There is a scene in that movie which stuck with me all the way back when I first saw it in the 70s, where God is picking up a box of cereal in a 1970s grocery store, reads the ingredients and says, it's all chemicals. You're poisoning the kids. It's terrible. That was back in the 70s. But anyhow.
Yeah, amazing. Amazing 50 years ago. And, we still have the same thing. And we get fooled over and over again, for example, people that want to be vegan to improve their health, and then they go and eat all of these packaged and processed vegan foods that are just filled with chemicals and poisons.
It's unreal, the exposure of things we get. My wife and I now regularly, every day, we cold press juice, both a green version and a carrot or apple version based on the Gerson method, which, by the way, just so people know, as I say it all the time, actually cured people of serious diseases, many serious diseases, on the idea that if all your cells had the proper nutrition, you would no longer be sick. But I don't know if you're ready to move forward, but I'd like to get through a few more things. So can we jump into the immune system here? Is it possible that the immune system that's been described to us is not really the immune system?
Yeah, absolutely. And it really ties in to this detoxification scheme. So the immune system once again, it fits in with that warfare paradigm. That, it's there to defend us. It's like our army. Even some of the cells are called things like natural killer cells. That's pretty scary. But really, the immune system performs a support function. And if you can, look at the immune system after making a decision that germ theory is not accurate, you'll see things in a very, very different light. So the immune system does regulate when the microbes come and clean up damaged tissue and when they go away. And because they are the sort of the foreman, like the support crew, they manage everything, they coordinate all of these big activities, and they do respond to threats. I mean, if your skin is broken from trauma, right, that's a threat, and your body needs to repair itself, and the immune system is the main system that responds to those situations. But the immune system also is involved in regulating the toxins in your body. Actually, a great example of this would be the aluminum from vaccines, that there's some recent science on that shows how this is managed. And it's quite interesting because the immune system ends up carrying it around as a sort of a standby passenger or an unintended passenger when it responds to different parts of your body to an acute situation. So I think you really need to start looking at the immune system differently. The other area is an autoimmune disease. And I mean, does it really make sense that our body would attack itself? You know? I mean, this grand design, so much complexity, and it works amazingly well. Why would it just attack itself?
Don't bring common sense into this conversation, please.
Well, it's just like, doctors wanting to remove parts of your body. Like, is there a part of your body that's really extraneous and not needed?
Well, is there?
No, I mean,
wait a minute. Are you telling me I needed that foreskin? Did I need that foreskin?
Well, possibly if you wanted some feeling there.
Yeah, you think? Unreal.
Now, you mentioned about autoimmune diseases. What about something like alopecia, which the mainstream blatantly calls an autoimmune disorder and makes all your hair fall out if you have the full-blown alopecia universalis?
Well, So the name of the autoimmune disease is alopecia areata. And so alopecia just means hair loss. And so it could be to varying degrees and a variety of causes. I think actually one of the main causes is malnutrition, with specifically connective tissue malnutrition. So hair loss is associated with several autoimmune disorders like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, if these are actually different things. But yeah, you definitely, I've seen patients like that, but it's also hard to tell did the hair loss come from the autoimmune disease or did it come from the treatment for the autoimmune disease? Because they're often using the same kind of therapies they use in cancer to treat autoimmune disease.
What about people who are born and then like at the age of 2, let's say, or 3, that their hair falls out? Boom. I have a friend whose son, it happened when he was around 12, I think.
Wow. Yeah, I've never encountered that myself. I don't know that it's a very common thing, but I would have to certainly, look at it case by case. I definitely worked with a teenager, or actually more than one, who pulled out their own hair and were essentially looked as if they were bald. And that's a psychological condition. It's called trichotillomania. And it had a purely psychological cause in the cases that I've been involved with. That was reversible. So I don't know. That's an interesting question.
All right, Andy, we're going to wrap up hour 1. There was so much more I wanted to get into hour 1 because it goes out everywhere. So I'm reasonably sure Jason and I are going to ask Andy back. And if for no other good reason, and there are plenty of good reasons, there's going to be a list left behind on the tail of 2 hours that has so many interesting things. And just let me talk about it. Antibiotics, are they deadly? The microbiome, what is it? What are the appendix? All the medicine we need is in nature. Medical errors, pharmaceuticals kill 150,000 people a year. Diabetes drugs killing people. Aluminum metals. I mean, it goes on and on. That is less than half of the list we're working from. But that does bring episode 203 to a close. So I'm going to ask you very quickly, Andy, is there a place where people can get in touch with you if they'd like to?
Yes, absolutely. I would encourage people to email me at Andrew Kaufman, MD at Proton Mail. And people can also look at my YouTube channel, which is under my name, Andrew Kaufman. It's called Medicamentum Authentica.
All right. As people may realize, I don't put anything in the descriptions on YouTube videos other than wishing everybody the best that I can. There's a reason for that. Most of this information will end up getting posted again for membership under the second hour. where we don't have to be concerned with things like censorship. So that's the first hour of 203. We're going to go into a ton of things in hour 2. We're going to go back on AIDS to state openly what we want to, diets for healing, about meat, GMO, dairy, soy, mental health, psychiatric drugs, schizophrenia, obesity. I mean, it goes on, and that's on top of the list I just read you. So join us for the second hour at crow777radio.com, CRROW777radio.com for hour 2. Hope to see you all there in the free speech zone. Cheers.
Belief is the enemy of knowing.